Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to the Long Room Hub here at Trinity College Dublin. Our event this afternoon is an opportunity to celebrate the project team that sits beyond the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. This is, in effect, the Beyond 2022 project team. I imagine most of you are familiar and have had a look at virtualtreasury.ie. If you haven't, go ahead and do that, and if you're at home, by all means, please do. We launched it yesterday at Dublin Castle, and it is the culmination of more than 5 years' work, maybe 6, maybe we're not quite sure, but it was an idea, and then it became a concept, and now it's become a reality, even if it's virtual reality. The idea of today's event is to discuss and to bring forward how we created the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. It started as an idea in 2015. Peter Crooks, our PI and the director of the project, who's a historian here at Trinity College Dublin, had this wonderful idea of seeing if the collections could be put back together. That morphed into Irish Research Council, a successful application the Irish Research Council did in 2016, which established what we now see as phase 1 of the project, 2016 to 2018, which was the proof of concept. And what we did was, we needed to understand how we would recreate the record treasury, and was there sufficient records in Ireland, in Britain, around the world that we could use to repopulate it. That was our proof of concept. We then moved into a second phase when the Irish government stepped in 2019, where we had their support and we could expand the team in 2020, 2021, 2022, and to produce what we launched yesterday, the Virtual Record Treasury. This wasn't an easy challenge. In actual fact, it was vast. The issues we faced were technological. They were the technology needed to be developed in many ways. The records needed to be identified, some of which were hiding in plain sight, and there was also the challenge of COVID. So it might come as a surprise, and it sort of came as a surprise to us yesterday when we realised it was the first time we'd actually stood together as a project team at Dublin Castle yesterday morning when we were all able to celebrate the launch. So we worked remotely, we worked very closely but remotely to develop the record treasury. But what is it? And I'll briefly try and explain that, and then I'm going to hand over. Professor Lorna Hughes, who's hiding here beside me, is going to chair the session. We've got Lynn Kilgannon, we've got Elizabeth Biggs, we've got Tim Murtagh, we've got Sarah Hendricks, we've got Dave Brown, we've got Gary Munley, we've got Fabrizio Orlandi, and we've got Brian Gurran. This is the core team that built the record treasury. These are the archival lead, the archival discovery lead, the research fellows, the computer scientists who are able to turn our ideas from a concept into a reality. And we want to try and champion and celebrate their work today, because it has been extraordinary, and it has been the privilege of my life to work with them. It is such a brilliant team to be part of. I'll give a brief synopsis of what we did, and then I'm going to be very quiet. I'm going to step out of the way, and I'm going to let them talk about their work. At the core of the concept, and at the core of the idea, is this. This is Herbert Wood's 1919 inventory of the PROI as it was. And it lists in varied and at sometimes insufficient detail what was in the record treasury. The first question was in 2018 with Gary Munley over there, and the now very sadly departed Shay Lawless, our most cherished friend. Could we turn that into a linked database? And the team in the ADAPT Centre got working on that, while a small team of historians, drawing on the knowledge and expertise of many people, many colleagues and friends around Ireland and Britain and beyond, started to investigate, are we going to be able to find sufficient records? Between 2016 and 2018, with the support of the Irish Research Council, the answer was overwhelmingly yes, we could do this. 2019 then, we really got to work in designing the digital architecture and building the digital infrastructure that allowed us to start, us historians I say, to start slotting records back onto the shelves virtually, linking these collections and creating the virtual record treasury. We worked in two kind of very close teams. We had the technology team based out of the ADAPT Centre, and we had what we call the archival discovery team, where the historians, the archivists, the conservators, the heritage scientists, all these people who have brought their knowledge and expertise into the project to help us make it a reality came together. And we had various levels of and methods of dealing with what we were identifying and finding. Some things we always knew were just going to be a line of metadata linking something back into Woods' guide. Others we decided, based on resources and based on if we thought it was worth following up, whether we would go and get it imaged. And then the next phase, well, what do we do with these images? Do we just put them up into the collection if they're legible, if people could deal with them? Do we want to impose transcribus upon them and create transcriptions? Do we want to go one step further and do natural language processing on them to try and automatically extract on scale the things that people will be searching for, the entities, the people, the places, the events, whatever it happens to be? And then do we go one step further and start to incorporate this massive piece of data that we've created, or break it down, Fabrizio and his colleagues, to make this really, really valuable and to create a knowledge base and a knowledge graph for Irish history. So that's been the process. We had our minimal work, we had very, very detailed work. We called our detailed work gold seams, and you'll hear these mentioned here, where we had identified collections that we absolutely wanted to pursue. Other things emerged in front of us. Some of it was hiding in plain sight, and it was only having the resource and the time to go and pull it all together that we've been able to grapple with the scale really of what we've found. So that's us. We are the Beyond 2022 team. We're like the construction company, as Kieran Wallace once described to me. We're the construction company that built what people know as the building or the virtual record treasury. So these are the people. I'm going to hand over to Lorna, and I'm going to step out of the way, and she's initially going to introduce Gary. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Yes, please lower the microphones for me. So thank you very much, Neil. I'm Lorna Hughes. I'm a Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Glasgow, and I'm the chair of the International Advisory Board for the project. So I'm really delighted to be here today. My role is very functional. My role is to introduce and hand over to this brilliant team of incredibly talented people who have achieved so much and built this virtual repository, this virtual record treasury of Ireland, under, as Neil said, difficult circumstances over the last couple of years when many of us could barely stagger to our spare room to log on to Zoom. Such amazing work has been going on here, so it's incredibly a privileged experience to see it launched yesterday. So the format of this is very straightforward. We're going to hear from each of the team in turn. Each of them is going to speak for about 7 minutes and just talk about their role in the project, because the overarching theme of this event is to help everybody understand how the virtual rebuild of a destroyed archive was accomplished and how this happened. The easy answer is you have this brilliant team, but it's more complicated than that, and they're going to explain all the different pieces of the project that they have achieved over the last year. So the first up is Gary. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to try and keep to time. So I'll give everybody the 7 minutes, and then I'll gesticulate in your general direction. And I'm also going to move the slides, so just let me know when you want your slides. So the first up is Gary. And Gary, you're going to tell us about your role and how you worked with historians to design a linked database.
So please take my slide right away. Can you all hear me? Okay. So my name is Gary. The official title is the Technical Architect on 2022. I joined the project in 2019, just after finishing my PhD. I was involved in the drawing of this diagram with Professor Nicholas Oldham this is actually one-to-one pulled from a whiteboard in his office, where we sat down and asked the question, right, so how are we going to do this? In talking about this, I'm actually only talking about one very narrow strip down at the bottom of the diagram. There's a strip up at the top there labeled 1, which Fabrizio will cover. And there's a whole load of stuff which, if you zoom in on it, we could talk about, but we don't really have time to. So my focus is on how did we get from historians to structured data in a database that we were able to use to reconstruct the PRY. Again, it's kind of hard to pick just a small number of things from a project that's been going on for this long that has so many different parts. I kind of landed on 3 significant things that I feel were done, which helped the project become what it is today. The first one is we leaned into existing archival standards from the off. In fact, as I joined, we had decided that ISIG would be a major standard that we would use for modeling archival data in this project. That did 2 really, really good things for us. First of all, as a computer scientist, it gave me something around which to design the database. It gave me a starting point. We knew it wasn't going to do absolutely everything that we needed, but it gave us a core thing to hold on to, and then we could grow out from there. We could lean into other standards as we needed to. Later on, we adopted IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework, got it in one, which is used to render all the image content on the database, or on the website, sorry, and that actually led to a whole other section of the database for modeling image content. But the second thing that ISIG did for us is it also helped us to really ask the question of what information are we going to capture, what parts are we going to model deeply, and what parts are maybe not so much not going to get as much attention, but basically what are the bits we're really, really going to focus on. If we were exclusively a project that focused on content from the medieval period, there is a way that we would build this database to facilitate medieval research, medievalists. We have 7 centuries of data in here, so there are certain compromises that were made on the database side, from my side, and there were, I think, a few compromises that the historians had to make as well. They were all very, very patient. But the use of ISIG, I think, was a great decision right from the off. It really gave us something to attach ourselves to at the start and build that core database around, and then we could expand from there. The second thing I'll say is that modeling historical data is bloody hard. Anyone who's ever had to do it knows it's a struggle. There's one example that keeps coming up, which I think highlights this perfectly. It's dates. Why? Basically, Peter, why? Dates are something which should be simple, right? I mean, it's the 28th of June, 2022. It's the year 2022. I don't know what year it is in Japan right now, or in China. But modeling a date is not as simple as putting a date into a database. There is uncertainty around historical dates. We might say that something happened around the year 1641, we might say it happened in the year 1641, or it might have happened on a specific day in the year 1641. We might not call it the year 1641, it might be the regnal year, I don't know who the monarch was.
16 Charles I.
Sorry?
16 Charles I.
16 Charles I. It could be the 16th year of the reign of Charles I. We wanted to be able to model what our historians were saying in the way they were saying it, while normalizing that into a representation that was parsable for the machine, so that we could do the analysis that we needed to do on it as well. So it's not enough to just put in a date like first year of the reign of Charles. We have to know what that year is so the computer can search it. And to do that, we leaned into an ontology called CDOC CRM, which actually formed the basis for a lot of the knowledge map as well, so Fabrizio might talk more about that, which gives these concepts of time spans. So we don't just have a date, we have a fuzzy date. And a date has a lower bound where it may have started, and an upper bound where it may have started, and a lower bound where it may have ended, and an upper bound where it may have ended. It's a crazy little corner of the database, and it took a lot of time and a lot of patience on the part of our historians to implement it. But once we got to the end, it meant that everyone was able to express their dates in the way they wanted to, but they are perfectly represented within the machine so that we can do comparisons irrespective of calendar or how specific you are. If you say 1641 or a specific date in 1641, we can compare those. So that's just one example of what should be a simple job, but it becomes very, very complicated when you try and do it quote unquote properly in a way that's both respectful of how archivists want to say what they are trying to say, and how we as computer scientists need to model the data so we can do what we have to do. A third thing, if I have time, which I think was an interesting approach we took, and worked well in some places and perhaps not so well in other places, was we put a little stopgap between the archivists and the database in the form of spreadsheets. So our approach to getting data into the, there's already Snickers. So these spreadsheets were interesting, right? The idea was that rather than directly entering information into the database, we would distribute prescribed spreadsheet templates to the historians. These would list across the header what information you should capture, how you should capture it. So if you wanted to say, I'm adding a new metadata record for an item, you had a list of things you had to add, and here's how it relates to the Public Records Office file. This was great from my perspective for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it meant that you could do validation across the data, so not just within an individual record, but is this actually consistent with everything else that you're saying as you add these records to the database. It meant that our historians could upload thousands of records in an instant. They just upload the spreadsheet and the machine does its job and it enters the virtual treasury well structured. It meant I could guarantee a certain level of consistency in the data. I'm not going to say there are no typos, but I will say there are no typos where I care. And that I can stand over. I think it was actually an interesting experience for the historians because that's probably the closest you've ever come to a compiler. Where you write code for hours into a text editor and then you give it to the machine and the machine says, no, you're wrong on line 4, 8, 6, 10, and on column 16. But I think that worked quite well in some places, but I understand it was a bit frustrating at times as well. So I think the overarching thing that I'm grateful for, and one of the things that has really made this project work as well as it has, is the patience on the part of our humanities counterparts, where at times we as computer scientists looked at a problem and said, actually, we need to think about this a little bit because we want to model what you are trying to model, but we want to do it well, we want to do it properly. I think we have done that every step of the way. I think I can absolutely stand over the data we gathered and say it is completely honest and we're very, very proud of what's sitting in our database right now.
That's you. Exactly 7 minutes. I don't know how you do it. This tells us what we need to know. So I'm now going to move on to Brian, who's going to talk about archival discovery, which is a clearly focused work package on the archival aspects. And Brian, I hope you're going to tell us about, with a focus on this key area of the project, how you moved from the brief description in Wood's Guide to rebuilding such a comprehensive suite of demographic resources.
Thanks, Lorna. You're going to hear a lot of talk about the gold seam over the next while, or the gold seams. And one of the 3 gold seams on the project is the 1766 religious census. This census originated with a resolution of the House of Lords passed on the 5th of March 1766, and it requested parish ministers to return to the House of Lords by the 5th of May a list of the parishioners in their parishes indicating the religion of each household head. Over the course of those 2 months, between the 5th of March and the 5th of May, hundreds and hundreds of returns poured into the House of Lords. And they were ultimately filed in the Parliamentary Returns Collection, which ended up in the Public Record Office. There were 803 returns in the collection, and they were each given an individual Parliamentary Returns number, running from number 648 to 1,448. Now, many years ago, myself and 2 very esteemed colleagues, Professor Liam Kennedy and Kirby Miller, we wrote a book of statistics on which covered the 1766 religious census. And we tried to include all statistical information on all parishes that we had information for, that information survived for. And in that, we included the parliamentary returns numbers where we knew it. Does this sound very bad? Or just push it back a bit? Okay, so we included the parliamentary returns numbers where we knew them, and we didn't know them in all cases, but where we knew them, we included the parliamentary returns numbers. But we did note in the introduction to it that even though we were including the parliamentary returns number, we did note that the numbering is now of no archival significance. Well, how wrong we were with that, because those parliamentary returns numbers, which we examined in considerable detail in the Beyond 2022 project, they ended up being the key to uncovering many, but not all, of the mysteries of the 1766 religious census. Now, if this census had been successfully prosecuted as per the Lord's resolution, the population of Ireland at the time was about 3 million, so since the resolution called for a return of householders' names, and if every minister had followed out the instruction and returned a list of names, we would have had in the Public Record Office roughly 600,000 names included in the religious census returns. But many ministers didn't do that. Many ministers just returned bare abstracts, bare numbers associated with for their parish. So they might give 50 Protestant households, 100 Catholic households, and they didn't give anything like the list of names at all. And we had, for many parishes and for many parts of the country, we had numbers for parishes. But what we didn't know was whether those numbers reflected the complete return, in that the minister only made a return of numbers, or whether they were only an abstract, that the minister had returned his list of names and just the numbers had been abstracted out of it by one of the various genealogists, and that the list of names had been destroyed. So the first thing we set about anyway was to examine these parliamentary returns numbers, and the simplest thing was to create a spreadsheet with all the individual numbers running from 648 to 1,448, and list down or record where we knew the parish names for each return number. And very quickly, by doing that, we started to see trends emerging. We saw that returns were filed by diocese, and we also saw that within the diocesan sets, the returns were organised in generally in alphabetical order. So that was something that was something that we found quite interesting. But we also found that if a return wasn't included in its diocesan bundle, it was included in another bundle called Bundle 79. And Bundle 79 was a miscellaneous bundle which contained returns which came in, but they didn't specify the diocese, so it was just a general catch-all diocese. Now, since we didn't know the parliamentary returns numbers for many parishes, but we did realise that there was an alphabetical structure to it, I began to try to reconstruct the bundles, reconstruct what I thought the bundles might look like based on sorting by alphabet. So I was trying to assign or guess what the numbers might be just by sorting our parishes that we had for each diocese by alphabetical order, and then determining a parliamentary returns number, and then in the explanation for the parish, in the notes for the parish, saying we're not quite sure that this is the number that would be associated with this parish, but we think that it might be because there's a general alphabetical structure to it. But at some stage, about a year ago, I came across a reference to the Parliamentary Returns Index, and it was for a parish called Burrishoole, and it said in volume 9 of the Parliamentary Returns Index on page 1961 you'll see Burrishoole, and it recorded that Burrishoole only returned numbers, it didn't return names, and I didn't know what this Parliamentary Returns Index was. Now we set about a long process trying to determine what it was, and it included queries to the National Archives, and I was asking the wrong questions, because when it turned up, I'm grateful to Peter Crooks, who eventually found it, or eventually found the reference, when it came back in, it was perfectly well catalogued within the National Archives, so I was asking the wrong questions. But what it did was it gave me the list of every single parish in all dioceses except County Meath, which returned returns for the 1766, and it also indicated, in most cases, sometimes there's a little bit of ambiguity, but in most cases they told me whether they returned names or numbers. So there followed, over the next 4 or 5 months, frantic rewriting of all the descriptions for the parishes and removing of all the points where, oh, I've guessed this and I think it might be this. Many of them were wrong. So what we ended up in the end, if that index hadn't turned up, we would have been producing a very, very makeshift set of 1766 return descriptions, but the the Parliamentary Returns Index changed the whole process, and we can now say that we know exactly what parishes returned 1766 returns, and in most cases we know whether they returned names or numbers, and it enabled us for the first time in 256 years to generate this map of 1766 census coverage, which covers about 80% of the country. So we're quite pleased to see that we were able to produce quite a significant, we were able to make quite significant advances on what we understand, our understanding in terms of the 1766 religious census. So thank you.
Thank you. So much, Brian, and it's just wonderful to see Ireland's first census there. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah and Tim, who are going to talk again about archival discovery and the sort of wide-ranging search possibilities. So Sarah and Tim, you were both responsible for searching the Irish and British repositories, and how did you go about this, and what were the challenges?
Yeah, thanks. There were a few challenges, shall we say, along the way. Unlike what you've just heard from the type of work that Brian was doing, for us, it was very much chasing a set of moving goalposts, I would say, in finding what we had. When we initially started, we were working from Woodside, which, as Neil was mentioning earlier, can vary wildly in its descriptions for material. So knowing what we were actually looking for in some cases was really quite difficult. So, for example, something like the Guild records, there's quite a good descriptive list that appears in the book. We know the dates and the types of events, and we know what was in there and not. And it has very specific listing. But then you'll get something that's like the Chief Secretary's office, and you'll get departmental letters, 100 years, and very little description. So there's no sense of how many there might be, where they might be, what they might be looking for. So to find these was always going to be tricky. Something that was the original plan, but didn't turn out to be the case, was that a lot of our searching would therefore be in person. So literally rummaging through boxes, some of them completely uncatalogued, quite literally finding things that we didn't know were there. And that was going to happen alongside, of course, the things that we knew were there and being able to put them into the database. So it was a bit of a mixture of the type of thing that you can see up here, not physical, but turned into this kind of scattergun approach of picking up the bits and pieces that we could find. And of course COVID then threw a spanner in the works. So suddenly all the plans for doing things in person, especially for myself at TNA, I was going to be in the basement every day with lots of documents all around, turned into an online search instead. And so from that, we also changed the parameters. So there was always the plan to look further afield than just TNA and PRONI, but that happened much earlier in the piece than what we had anticipated, and became a broader search around the major repositories, not just of the UK, but even as far as Australia. And so, of course, as well, like the search terms changed. So I found myself searching for things like Ireland, and downloading the many thousands of responses that you get when you put that into something like the British Library. You can just imagine the scale of what was coming back. So suddenly how we were searching and what we were finding was a very different thing. And then try matching that to Wood, where you don't really know what any of these things mean. So it's been a bit of a trial and error, shall we say, over the last couple of years. But I think we found ways to kind of narrow down what we were looking for, and as we became more familiar with Wood, And as we, were working with Gary and working out how metadata actually worked and what we really needed to have in there, the types of parameters we were searching for, it became easier to narrow down results and to focus our searches into particular areas. So rather than trying to cover the whole of Woods Guide and this scattergun approach to everything, it was picking areas that we knew that we could really kind of delve into a particular repository or a particular type of record and find what we could until we could get back in, which has been quite recent, but it's been lovely to actually finally be back in with the records, and in many cases that's kind of validated the things that we found online that we weren't sure whether they were actually going to turn out to be what we thought they were. And in other times it's thrown up other things that we didn't expect. So I guess for us it's very much a work in progress. We really have only scratched the surface of it. And our experience of it is very different depending on the types of repositories that we've been working on and where we've been. And I know Tim's experience is very different in Prony even to myself in London. So I think maybe the only real commonality with the whole of archival discovery is that we've all had a very unique experience in trying to find what we can. But I'll let Tim say some more about his experience.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so to speak to what Sarah was saying, I mean, we started our program for archival research sort of in the spring of 2020, just as the pandemic hit. Obviously that has a huge impact on how we're going to go about doing it, but one of the sort of silver linings was it did afford us a bit of time. But we were denied the pleasure of sort of going into the archives and made that excitement of actually looking through documents, but it sort of forced us to sort of concentrate on what was there already in terms of finding aids. So for instance, in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, as what I think is quite a strong e-catalogue, my main sort of opposite numbers in Prony, who I was collaborating with Janet Hancock and Stephen Scarth, had both been responsible for the digitization of pre-existing paper hand lists and catalogues and calendars into that e-catalogue. So already I was sort of off to a good start. And sort of the first sort of step of archival discovery for me in Prony was to really get a good handle on the e-catalogue, not just by searching, but also, for instance, reading through old deputy keepers' reports. One of the very significant things about Prony as a core partner is that Prony is one of the two direct successor institutions to the Destroyed Records Office. There's obviously the National Archives of Ireland, a much direct successor, but Prony was set up only a year after its centenary is coming next year. The first deputy keeper of Prony, David Chart, was a former employee of the Destroyed Archive. So what you see when you read through their own deputy keepers' reports that started in from the 1920s is you begin to see sort of how Prony as an archive was formed, what it was targeting through the decades. And it was very much targeting in the 20s and 30s replacement documents. They were essentially doing what we were doing in an analog era 100 years ago. That begins to sort of guide you to where you're looking in Prony. So for instance, one thing we were very excited about was finding, and this is something Prony went out of its way to collect, were direct transcriptions. The Destroyed Public Records Office before 1922 was, we got to remember, a working archive, and it wasn't just gentlemen scholars. It was genealogists, paid researchers, records agents as they were known in the parlance at the time, people who, like Tennyson Groves, who was a very significant transcriber of materials pre-1922. Prony went out of its way to collect notes of antiquarians. Another example, which you'll find on the Virtual Replica Treasury under Prony, if you decide to browse through, are the Maxwell Given papers, an amateur historian of Coleraine who filmed 24 volumes of notes from various sources before 1922 about Coleraine. It captures, it's all Coleraine-centric, granted, but it captures some documents that are now no longer there. And it shows you sort of what was in there. It gives you a bit more of a flavor than Wood's Guide is perhaps giving you when you give it a single line. The other category which you see emerge from those deputy keepers' reports of the 20s and 30s is that Prony targeted the private collections of sort of the great and the good of Ulster. What this meant is that it captures many times in private archives substitutes or very good substitutes for official records. So as Sarah was describing, we began to zero in on certain areas from Wood's Guide, not necessarily gold seams, but try to play to the strengths of each archive. In Prony, one of the things that you have very strong material for is the Chief Secretary's Office. Lord Lieutenants, Chief Secretaries, their Under-Secretaries, these roles between the 18th and 19th century were sort of very central in the executive government in Dublin Castle. There are several very good collections in Prony. The Castlereagh papers would be sort of one of the best known, but you also have some brilliant archives such as the papers of Sir George Macartney, in many ways the first modern Chief Secretary of the 1760s. You have papers of Lord Anglesey, or Lord Lieutenant, and several other smaller, more discreet sources. Now, the challenge for me was, those are huge collections, was to, via the e-catalogue, to narrow down what parts of those very vast collections would actually be very strong direct replacements for what was destroyed. Now, I do have to sort of say I was very fortunate with Prony in terms of, as soon as they could facilitate access on site, they did. It was very trying conditions. They were only allowed a certain number of people in the building, but as soon as we could be given access, as soon as the building was actually opened again, we were getting access. So, I mean, limited as it may be, they really were great collaborators in facilitating that. One of the other areas we have also targeted Prony, and I think this is something that Brian has really brought to the table in this research phase, is records of the grand jury, which is something Brian is quite well versed on. Prony is an odd institution, in that it is both a sort of state-level archive, while also retaining many of the features you would see in a sort of county records office in England. Thus, it has basically all the records, or most of the records, very strong records, of the grand juries for the 6 counties in Northern Ireland. Again, a really, really important collection that we've only sort of really teased, but there's some really promising work there. The other area, of course, the sort of final area I'll finish up on, is diocesan collections. Again, Prony has a very strong track record of collecting those over its years of existence. And you'll begin to see some of those filtering through onto the official record treasury, both in terms of very strong metadata, but also images that are provided. So that's a little flavor of what's going on in Prony.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Tim. I'm now going to hand over to Elizabeth and Lynn. We're going to talk about the medieval exchequer, which, unlike archival discovery, had a very broad remit. Your work on the medieval exchequer was very focused. So can you tell us a little bit about how that worked, how you approached that work and how it evolved?
Thank you. The medieval exchequer is a very coherent archive in itself within the National Archives of the UK. So unlike Sarah and Tim, who had to work out where they were looking for materials and how to relate things to Wood's Guide, what we had was there were 400 files in the National Archives of the UK, which were created in Dublin between the 1270s and 1446, which were contemporaneously brought over to England and brought into the archives of the English state in London and then moved to Kew. So we had a known body of materials and a known collection which historians have been using since the 19th century, but that haven't been edited fully. There's one section of it that has been edited extremely well by Bill Connolly at the National Archives of Ireland, whose work we use and which we've now made available on the website. So we knew about the records, we knew that there was this body of material which was a direct parallel for the archives that you would have found in the Public Record Office of Ireland in 1922. It's the same material. One stream of it would have gone to the Irish records, first in the Birmingham Tower, and then eventually in 1867 to the Public Record Office of Ireland. And the other stream of copies went straight to London. So it's a parallel archive built up in the Middle Ages, which is extraordinary. It's the kind of direct replacement that you don't find in that quantity elsewhere. And that's why it was the medieval exchequer gold scene. That's why we got to be the gold scene. But these records are difficult, even for people who work on medieval government, because they're incredibly compressed, incredibly tightly written Latin. You can see on the screen behind you. They're formulaic financial records, which you need to know the conventions, you need to extend them, you need to be working with them to deal with them. So the first and most basic task for us was to work out how are we going to make these accessible? How can we make the information that's included in them usable, not just by people who are trained in working with English government and particularly English governmental finance of this period. They contain extraordinary amount of detail about Ireland in the late Middle Ages. You know, it's people, it's places, it's the kind of events that are going on in English government in Ireland. So, you know, there's a lot in there for people who want to know things about them, but they're very hard to use if you're not already used to using them. So what we needed to do was to find a way to make them accessible and searchable, and then to bring them into Gary's structure, and to work with them in a way that we could, let people use them. So what you've got on the screen here is an example of a set of fees that was paid to the Digitio, John Rogan, in circa the end of the 13th century. And you can see that we've got the original, we've linked it to Phil Connolly's edition of the exact same thing, and we've then marked it up in a way that makes it readable and comprehensible to the computer, so that people can run analysis on it. But that all had to be structured, and we spent a huge amount of time trying to get the structure exactly right so that we could reflect the original records in their complexity, because they are not standard. How do we make these things workable across a corpus which includes some very formulaic stuff, but then bits where the clocks start going? And we just added this bit of parchment to a roll because we found it down, the back of someone's bed. Not quite that level, but that they're very much working in kind of, we'll just add bits here and there. But so that was our big challenge, was taking this material and turning it from this analog format into something that can be used more widely. And,
I can talk a little bit more about that aspect of it, because it was one of the most back in the previous one, sorry. But I think for us one of the most rewarding parts of the Gold Seam was working with our computer scientists, working with new technologies, because at the end of the day both of us came into this project as medievalists, so we're trained in Latin translations, in paleography, but marking up the material in TEI, which is, that's what you're seeing represented on screen, and it's basically a way of encoding historical texts so that everybody can access them, but also to enhance kind of searchability for these texts, so that people can look for the people and the places, and for us the financial sums. So we're kind of developing tools on the tech side to do some really cool financial analyses, hopefully in the future, of these records as well. So I think that was one of the most exciting parts for us. Also kind of nightmarish, because I don't think I'd ever seen or known about the frustration that can arise from validation errors and structuring div tags, and these terms weren't even familiar to me at all beforehand. But I learned a new hatred of validation errors from this project. But ultimately, seeing them go in, seeing these records now in the Treasury, and being searchable and being there in their English translations and linked to the images is intensely rewarding, and seeing what we can do with them, because that was another really important part of the project on the medieval Gold Seam. We kind of acted a little bit as a guinea pig, maybe I could say, for some of the technological work on the computer science side, particularly work on the knowledge graph in its earliest days, and I know Fabrizio is going to talk about that more, but for instance, Phil Connolly's edition of the issue rolls, so the calendar of issue rolls, served as our test case for building a lot of the early structure for the schemas for the knowledge graph, and working out the Beyond 2022 ontology, which kind of underpins a portion of that graph as well. So I think, for us, it wasn't just about taking these records, finding this replacement source, it was about looking to the future, and to kind of what we could do with these materials. So I think that would sum it up on that end.
And there's also a conservation side in this. I should flag that TNA used the medieval extractor material to really try and push what can be done with documents that aren't readable. There is new multispectral imaging that they've been using for a while, which they were able to use to get some of these documents. And there's a couple of new techniques that are getting developed now where multispectral imaging fails. And we were able to say, there's a couple of examples where we have really interesting documents. We know they're fascinating, but we can't read them with multispectral. So let's send them off to the scientists at UCL that they're collaborating with. There's also a side in which these are records that had to be conserved at scale. You know, the conservation department at TNA had to take 400 items which had been used, which were used, but hadn't been conserved or checked as a group for a long time, and say, okay, how are we going to conserve them, and how are we going to make them accessible for the digitization process? And so we were able to get those images and work with those images and make them available. But there's an awful lot of science that's underpinning that, and an awful lot of, again, looking to the future, ways in which these documents can become even more readable in the future, because TNA is working on at that very edge of what the conservation can do.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Phil. And lots there to pick up in discussion about next stages around using the images. So I'm now going to hand over to Dave, who's going to talk again in archival discovery aspects, but really focusing on making the images usable and searchable. So you had the responsibility for not just finding the records, but for making them accessible. So could you describe your approach? There we go.
Okay, this is the latest version of our machine transcription model for early modern handwriting. It finished cooking about 2 weeks ago. The text you're looking at has not been edited. That's the automatic transcription. So as you can see, it'll probably be the last iteration because it doesn't really make any mistakes anymore. Also, I was going to proofread it and then I realized that I probably couldn't, which just demonstrates that a machine is now doing things that most humans basically can't do, which is what we want out of artificial intelligence. And it's an example of how AI is, over the past, say, 5 years, has given the world a jolt from which it basically hasn't recovered. The AI is now everywhere, it's following us around the place, it's helping us do our shopping, it's telling us where to go for our holidays. And this is an example of a useful application for it. Beyond 2022, what we've done is apply machine learning, which is a branch of artificial intelligence, to automatically transcribe handwritten texts. And we built a productivity tool that saves you from having to transcribe the text yourselves, or indeed read it at all in order to make it searchable. And this is an incredible time saver, especially if you're doing that kind of needle in a haystack research, or you want to go back and check a reference. You can put in the keyword and it'll pop out of the manuscript automatically. And also, if you want to make a quick start in preparing a critical edition for eventual publication, it will make you a first draft of pretty much any English language handwriting that we have now, and the Latin is advancing at a fairly rapid rate. The background to this actually goes back to Shay Lawless. Shay led a Horizon 2020 application that Kieran Wallace and I worked on. I think you worked on it as well back in 2014. And the Transcribus people who make this platform won the grant. And when they were doing their launch, I thought, I'll go over there and look at a couple of pathetic slides and listen to them saying how it was never really going to work, but they did their best. But the thing actually did work. So it makes you, this has come out of a burst of sour grapes. Nice weekend in Vienna to watch the presentation. So it's a machine learning platform, especially configured to aid the transcription of historical manuscripts. And we fed the machine 2 million words of accurate transcriptions of text in English and Latin. And the text was originally created between 1600 and 1900. The machine also gets a digital image of the original manuscript. The software identifies the lines of text in the image and breaks the lines into words. The pictures of words and the letters within them are matched to the transcriptions, and the computer learns which geometries, the squiggly lines and dots and dashes and so on, that make up handwriting, and how it corresponds to which words and letters that have been put into the system. And machine learning works with probabilities. This is a really, really basic one, right? Okay? Okay? No. You want to follow me? Right? So no two hands are identical, and nobody writes the same word over and over again in exactly the same way. What Transcribus does is take all these pictures of words and letters and the matching text and produces mathematical models for each. The program then examines the new image that wasn't part of the training data and tries to match the geometry of the letters. As there will never be an exact match, the algorithm calculates the most likely one, the most probable. This approach is also called neural computing. because it works in a similar way to the way we make decisions. We don't go about our day in a sequence of yes/no decisions, but make probabilistic assumptions about things based on what we know already. So it works the same way. What we've ended up with is an AI that can transcribe most neat handwriting to a high degree of accuracy. It's not perfect, but it's high. We can transcribe a typical 300-word page of handwritten text in about 30 seconds. And that's an entire volume every hour or so, which is a lot faster than sitting in a library taking notes. It means you can ask a colleague working in a remote archive to take the pictures for you, upload them to a shared server, and search them for the bit of information you're looking for by the end of the day. I'm currently using it to process rentals. I take pictures of the National Library, and then I copy the lists and names and rents directly into a spreadsheet. It's an incredibly fast and efficient process for basically the vague thing I'm trying to pull out of it. So I think we can also expect a bit of pushback, because in some ways, the idea that a machine can replace honest, time-consuming, scholarly endeavour is anathema to the academic way of life. And deep down, and I know there's been a lot of fun on me today, but deep down, the humanities have always had it in for the engineers. They were pointed inventing an entirely new discipline, digital humanities, just to keep you all on track. As a humanities scholar, I often struggle with the most basic engineering concepts. Deadlines is an obvious one. There are others. But the benefits of our multidisciplinary collaboration between history and computer science are now as evident as they are compelling, for what we've achieved is a major step towards the democratization of historical research. Most people can't read this stuff. Most people can now read it the way it's been presented to them. So we're privileged here in Trinity to have access to one of the world's finest research libraries, and the training that enables us to access and interpret historical sources. In many ways, it's also an old-fashioned organizational hierarchy in which a decreasing number of people have access to an increasing amount of knowledge. So Beyond 22 is flattening this hierarchy, first by equalizing access to many more people to our written memory, and second by making historical sources far easier to search and read. We're sacrificing some of our authority as experts to democratize and allow the general public to do what we are privileged to be able to do by being here. So we found archival records in the most unlikely places. And the next chapters of historical research are also likely to emerge from a far wider community and from corners that we're not expecting it to come from.
I'm going to hand over now to Fabrizio, who's going to focus on some of these technological aspects and to tell us how you worked with the data to give it some shape to guide the researchers.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the knowledge graph. So the knowledge graph, I wanted just to introduce the term because it can be a little bit of a vague word or term for defining a sort of advanced type of database. So a knowledge graph is something a bit more than just a regular database. It's not just data sitting into tables, into some storage system. It's actually a network of interconnected data points where the meaning is actually attached and the semantics are attached to these data points. Just to give you an idea, I prepared an image here. So this is just a small portion of like a representation of a knowledge graph. And here you can see there are nodes and edges connecting all these nodes. And each one of these edges basically describes the connection, the relationship between the nodes in a graph. So all these data points that we have in a graph. And to do this, we used standard semantic web technologies. So we followed standards like RDF and the Sparkle and Triple Source. So, but I won't go into detail with all these technologies. But there are international standards for generating these knowledge graphs, and we follow the best practices. And the advantage of doing that is not only that we can encode the meaning into a big, large database and have machine interpreting and using this information which is encoded into databases, but also it makes it very easy for us to integrate many different data sources together. So heterogeneous data sources can be easily interconnected into a big graph. And also these technologies make it very easy to publish information online, so publish everything online on the web, so that people and researchers and everyone on the web can actually easily access the information just by using their web browser. So data is not sitting like in a database and static database, but actually it's dynamic and it's live and it's on the web. So researchers all over the world can actually use it. And so this graph we created, it's the first of its kind in Ireland because it's the first 5-star linked data knowledge graph that we have in Ireland for Irish history, and I'm very proud of this. We also managed to interconnect this graph with external data sources like Wikidata. So this graph is not just a data silo, but it's actually interconnected with other popular knowledge graphs on the web. We managed to put together around 2.7 million statements or triples. So there are some stats there, but you can find more information on the website. And so 2.7 million facts might sound like a lot of data, but actually we could have had a much larger knowledge graph just by adding more data. But what we wanted to do was actually to focus on having like high quality data and curated type of data in our knowledge graph. And I think that's what we managed to achieve. So we also built different tools. They are also on the website. The tools they are using the knowledge graph. So there are tools for navigating the graph and visualizing it in a similar way as you can see on the slide. We have tools for searching, for navigating timelines, so some visualization tools. And then I really hope this knowledge graph can evolve in the future and the community can still evolve it and make it expand because there's a lot of potential for applications related to machine learning, discovering new links, new interconnections, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Thanks. And finally, Emer Gilmartin from the ADAPT Centre is going to talk about some new technologies looking to the future, specifically around
voice agents. And Emer Gilmartin thought she was speaking for 1 minute, and now has found out it was 5 for a while, now it's 7. So Emer Gilmartin is going to make sure that this works while she speaks. First of all, I think it's really important to say that everybody here has done an enormous amount of work, and going from Brian talking about getting the census working, getting the information from the census, right up to Fabrizio talking about making triples of the data so they can be searched. It's all about helping people access data. Everything that's been said is about accessing data. And I came in at sort of the last part, which is where we looked at making a voice agent which could help people interpret the collection. The audience we are dealing with are non-specialists. For example, children who are going to look at this for the first time, who are going to explore the 3D model. And the ask was to create a voice agent or a digital assistant, a speech-to-speech system where you could ask questions of a virtual agent in the model, and the virtual agent could also tell you about the model. Now, I might need a little bit of help here just to get this to come out to this one. I think I'm missing one link here. Thank you. Yeah.
Might have to put it inside.
I've got the HDMI, so it should do it.
I think this is.
Yeah, both. We'll
Yeah,
see
just
what
as
we
you say.
forget. Okay, so. I might just have to do this again. So, I thought the best thing to do was to just show you very quick. This is HDMI. Give it a sec. Might just. I think it's seen it now. Yeah, and I go to. Is that actually a PC?
Yeah.
Do you reckon pull it from the web?
Was it that the volume was too low?
No, I can pull the
Oh.
system itself from the web. It's easier. Sorry about this.
And
I just need to get to
hang
the
on.
Tinternet.
It's not touch screen, so I just have to put it over here.
Okay.
There you go.
So,
Nice there.
sorry about this, lads. So they asked us to create a digital assistant, a spoken agent. And at the beginning, this was really the work of Anton Gerdelan. I don't know what. Aha, sorry. Okay, so who has since moved on to work further in 3D. The idea was to create a system where here we are. Okay, so hopefully this works. The idea was to create a system that would sit within the virtual record treasury, within the 3D model, where you could go in, you could find points, press a button, and hear something about the room you were in. So for example, now you see the model loading, which won't happen in the production model, but I think it gives us a very good indication of the amount of information that's in that model alone. There are all these tiny elements that need to be loaded. So then we get to the model, we can look around, we can move around, we can look around the building, and with any luck we'll hear.
Hi there. I'm the keeper. I'll help you learn more about the archive. We're outside the Public Record Office, as it was in 1922. You can swipe on the screen to look around you. The front part of the building is where the public went to look at the archives. They sat at desks in a quiet reading room, with an archivist making sure that nobody scribbled on the records or damaged them in any way. The staff working in the archive also had their offices in this front building. The tall building with the arched windows is the record treasury, where all the ancient records were stored. These huge windows and a glass roof made it very bright inside, so you didn't need to use dangerous gas lamps or candles to read the documents. 6 floors of metal shelves and walkways were filled with millions of historic records, and more were stored in the stone vaults beneath the floor. After the fire in 1922, a few bundles of papers were saved from these vaults, scorched but still legible. These are the only precious originals from the destroyed Public Record Office of Ireland. The front and back buildings do not touch. There's a gap, a fire break, about 10 metres wide. This was to protect the papers in the record treasury from any fire that might break out in the front building with its coal fires, gas lamps and pipe smoking staff. You can find me anywhere you see my logo inside the building. It's a white square with a black triangle. To go inside, press the green marker just outside the main door. You can use these markers to move around the building.
Now,
Bye for now. Hope to see you inside.
I don't know how familiar you are with the inside of this model, but as you can see, there are lots and lots put in by NoHo and the web development company, little points which give you extra information. So there's, but the triangle lets you talk.
Hi there. We're standing in a room that no longer exists. This was the reading room of the Public Record Office in Dublin. The building was badly damaged in 1922. The Public Record Office was open to all members of the public. Lawyers used the archive regularly to check legal cases. It was also used by people interested in local and family histories. This is where the public went to look at the archives. They sat at desks to read the documents. There was always an archivist keeping an eye, making sure that nobody scribbled on the records or damaged them in any way. There are about 100,000 linear feet of shelves in the record treasury, with records in all formats, including rolls and books. Rolls, or scrolls, were long strips of animal skin called parchment, rolled up to form a cylinder shape. These were stored on racks inside the treasury. There were also hundreds of books with handwriting from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. The oldest book was from about 1290, called the Red Book of the Exchequer. It contained a copy of Magna Carta.
Did you know that Ireland had the best local maps in the world in the 17th century?
No?
It's an interesting story. Can I tell you about it?
Yes. Now this won't work
In
because
1641, Irish landowners rebelled against the English Parliament.
so it'll answer questions.
In 1642, the English
wrapping
Parliament
up
rebelled
now.
against King Charles I. Charles was executed in 1649.
I wish
and
someone could
Parliament
explain what
decided
that
to
leopard
confiscate
is
the
doing
Irish
there.
land. Oliver Cromwell was sent over to defeat the Irish. In 1655, Ireland was mapped and measured by William Petty.
These maps are called the Down Survey.
They were the most detailed maps ever made of any country. Most Irish places can be found on these maps, but the spellings are very strange. The Down Survey gives us a lot of information about places in Ireland. Together with other documents in the archives, it can help us see what happened in the past. Now let's see what we can find for you. What county are you from yourself?
Donegal.
Donegal.
Interesting place. Here's a map I found in the archive.
And I've just been told to,
Okay.
and I definitely will
That's enough
because
for me.
sorry about the technical problems, but she also answers 70 questions about the contents, and anybody who'd like to try her out in the room there after we've finished, more than welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So thank you so much to all the panel. Fantastic presentations. We have time for questions from the audience. So if anybody would like to ask a question, I'm not sure if we have a microphone or if you want me just to repeat the question for the streaming.
If anybody at home on Facebook has questions, we can relate them. So.
Can we relay questions from the virtual audience as well? So that's grand. But I saw hands going up there.
Just general question to anyone in the panel. I presume there are scans of documents, or are the shelf marks to direct historians to other archives? I presume they're actually scans to appeal to the wider public.
In most cases, there are scans, and in some cases, we haven't got the scanning done yet.
But we have the shelf marks. Say, for example, it was found in Kew. If I find a shelf, I'd be able to go to Kew and find it. Yeah, that's fine.
There's sort of symbols on the website that tell you if there's a picture or if there's transcribed text.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you.
Any other questions from the remote audience or the physical audience? Any others? Yes?
I'm totally one of those members of the public or whatever that knows nothing about any of that. I'm just wondering, are you planning, it seems like an incredible project, but is it planned to be in schools? Because I know a lot of kids don't kind of, history, for me anyway, I'm really interested in it, but when I was in school, I couldn't just the dates, the way it was written, and this seems like a really interactive, brilliant way for kids to kind of learn
Yeah.
history and get inside it.
Yeah, I can take that. As part of this, I spoke to history teachers and some school children, because the idea of the virtual agent end of it is the bulk of the work is towards getting adults access to this incredibly rich resource. But to keep the access going, there are probably budding historians out there. And it seems that the primary and secondary school curriculum have an increased focus on local history and personal history. So we could easily see ways in which you could build online resources for teachers who could set it as homework or do it in class, where the students, the kids, could be given a set of questions to ask the archive. Then download, say, a family member or a local person's census records from as far back as you could go and complete a project. And then you've got this portfolio-based piece, which fits in absolutely with the new curricula for primary and secondary.
That's brilliant, because there's so many people not doing history now in school, and it seems to me that a lot of people's interest in history only comes later.
Yes.
When they've experience of the world, kind of, but to allow us to have an imaginative beginning.
Exactly.
Kind
And
of, yeah, and practical. Yeah.
absolutely, because the history teachers I spoke to, one of them said it, and not she said, they just won't read for me. But they'll watch and they'll interact, especially the younger kids. So I think there is definitely a sort of a very useful application there. You know, and then as they by the time they're in Leaving Cert, I presume they'd be able to use the adult version. You know.
So something which is probably worth mentioning as well is, I mean, there's a distinction to be made between the website and the actual, what I would call the archive data at the core of the whole thing. The database is exposed through a series of what are called REST APIs, which means other software developers can come along and hook their own applications into what we've built. So if you wanted to, right, in theory, there's nothing stopping you from building an educational platform using the data from our API. And we've built it, as Peter says, to democratize access to these archives, right? And the whole idea is if you want to build something, go ahead, the APIs are there, the documentation is there.
And the data, do you mean the maps and the pictures and everything?
Yeah,
or
yeah,
just
yeah.
the database?
No, everything's up there, so the
And,
knowledge graph, the maps, the images, the AAAF manifests, it's all there.
And the beauty of what the guys are doing is that a natural language query makes it more accessible even then to really get into the archive itself.
Thanks. Jane, I think you had a question.
Well, firstly, congratulations. I mean, it's just fabulous to hear the story from, you know, through your voices. So again, heartiest congratulations, Kieran, Peter, and you all. So I suppose I have two parts to this question. One relates to Transcribus. Obviously, David, I'm so delighted to hear it's 100% accurate. That's brilliant, because it's all about the integrity of the data at the end of the day. But I'm really curious to get a sense of how far back you can take it. In other words, that medieval handwriting, especially the numbers, actually. So in other words, what are the limitations of Transcribus? And then linked to that, and just picking up on what Gary said there, is what you've created here is phenomenal and very flexible. And obviously the knowledge graph is a tremendously important innovation. But I'm wondering how those digital orphans, and I put the 1641 depositions website out as a digital orphan, a digital silo, can be sucked in here. And that's just an example of one. And it's interoperability is, I suppose, how interoperable is all of this?
So I actually have a lot of love for the 1641 depositions.
It's very hard to hear you.
Sorry, I have a lot of love for the 1641 depositions project because that was my first job here.
I remember.
So yeah, I'd love to see that moved in. There's nothing stopping us from integrating something like the 1641 depositions with the archive that I can see. It would be worth sitting down and talking about it. As I said, we built the database, just the database component around ICG. So we need to look at how we would maybe map the fields we have in the 1641 depositions projects to those ICG fields. But we've seen through the TNA Exchequer records that there's no problem rendering TEI manifests in the web page, and if we have facsimiles and images, we're able to link those back to the TEI transcriptions. It might take a little bit of modification, but we can insert tags into the manifest so we can go from transcribed text to image and back. I obviously can't speak for every digital orphan, but 1641 set in the back of my mind quite a lot in this project, and yeah, there are various points where yeah, you can probably do that, that'd be fine. So just speaking to that project, I personally don't see any issue with integrating those things. We built this to be a very, very generic platform. I think quite successful.
The 17th century model you were looking at actually has a lot of 1641 depositions, images and text image. But what we do is we reuse text and images from existing projects where we can. Where we're moving out of the models is a group of us in the Transcribus community who have large amounts of text, have now formed a research group of our own, and we are now combining our various stocks of text and hands and styles and languages into these very, very large multi-million word models. And these serve as base models then for doing more specific hands later on down the road. As an example, we have the Walter Harris papers. We photographed a few volumes of those in the National Library a long time ago. Our transcribus result wasn't great. A couple of months ago, we combined, it's mainly in Latin, and a couple of months ago we combined an 18th century Latin hand from the National Archives of the Netherlands that was quite similar to Harris's hand, with our own Harris ground truth, and just with some more similar text that padded out, and it gave an excellent result. So what we're doing with the earlier Latin, there's a lot of Latin ground truth that's been done in France, in the Netherlands, and in Germany, and a small amount has been done, I think, in Canada of TNA records. They have quite a big ground truth there from the project. So we'll bundle those together, and that will become a base model. It's called a base model because it has all the characters in it already, and a reasonable average of the type of hand you're looking at. Then we can put some of our existing text on top of that, and that should work. It should work as well as that is. So we're moving quite quickly.
And I suppose we could come in a little bit on the in terms of the medieval records. For me, I think it's the beauty of it is when all of these different components are working together. And what we're looking to do, I think, with the medieval records is quite a different thing in terms of using, say, something like transcribus, because we're getting quantity and we're getting quality as well, and marking things up in using things like TEI and making them accessible. This is actually bringing us as close as we can get, to representing the manuscripts themselves, which continue to be there in TNA, and they're incredibly important. And having tools to allow us to represent as much as we can about the physical forms of these manuscripts and maintain that connection is incredibly important, and that's also part of it. So,
I'll also comment. There's been some work done on getting medieval documents into transcribus. It's not yet anywhere near as good as what the 17th century ones are. And one of the big problems has been, and we did a bit of work on this very early on, Sarah and I, is that the medieval Latin they love their abbreviations, and training the computer to see an abbreviation and expand it correctly is incredibly difficult. The most obvious example is P with a line through it can be P-E-R, it can be P-A-R, it can be P-R-E, and so you need to train the computer not just in a basic expansion, but then working out which of the possible expansions turns into an actual Latin word. And then, of course, that doesn't give you the translation. So you're making it accessible in terms of readability, but you're not making it accessible in terms of actual language. So there's work ongoing on that, and I've sort of been keeping an eye on some of the things that people have been doing with medieval manuscript material and making that Latin layer possible. The other thing to say about that is that where transcribus is really come in handy with the medieval records is with the Record Commission material, so the RC8s and the other 19th century calendars or copies or extracts from the medieval records that were the Public Record Office of Ireland. Those are in a 19th century handwriting. They often use the Latin abbreviations. That's why we were looking at them to start trying to get expansions that would make them usable. But if you can get that material in and use those models to provide and develop, those records will suddenly become a lot more useful.
I think, yes, got a question there.
For David, if you had a set of papers that you wanted to submit to Transcribus, would that be possible?
You download the software. You upload your images. It's your own account. And you get the first 100 odd pages for free, and then you pay a few cents a page.
And so, like, if it's in the National Library, you have to kind of take a picture of it. And then
Yeah, camera phone pictures are fine. And then you select, depending on what type of hand it is, you select. There's plenty of public models. We've made one available. The Beyond 2022 model that will work on lots of different hands in English. And Transcribus also have their own English model hand, which works very well for 19th century. Basically, just pick one and see how it goes.
Thanks.
We've got a question from Kieran, and then we've got a question from online visitor.
We'll go to the online
Do you want
first.
to do the online one first?
This is a question from Aoife Rickard, and she says the voice assistant aspect is really great, very user-friendly, especially in that it can answer questions. Is it envisioned to expand that into the future in terms of what it can answer?
Sorry, okay. The big problem here is that it's natural language, and you've no idea what people are going to ask. So we started by getting seeded questions from the historians, which then had to be sort of speechified in terms of language because they were quite erudite to begin with, but we all went through a process of. So we have answers, and we can create answers all we like because we know all about the archive. Questions are going in a sort of a, which I've forgotten the word, basically everyone who uses the system, if they ask a question the system doesn't know the answer to, it's recorded. And we'll find an answer and add it. The system has a little, oh, I don't know about that one, but I'll ask an expert and I'll know the next time. The second part is not just the basic questions you would ask the system, which will always be a mystery to us and we will crowdsource on an ongoing basis, but the fact that you can ask the same question in many, many ways. So for example, the 70 questions we have on the system so far will expand into something like 12,000 questions. When you think of it, every time someone asks a question, for example, how high is the roof? They could ask, how high is the roof in here? How high is the roof in the archive? How high is the roof in the archives? How high was the roof in the archives? How high is the ceiling? How high was the ceiling? And we need to know all of that. So in the beginning, you more or less bootstrap it by creating the questions and creating the variants of the questions. But what you do then is you put in a machine learning model that will start looking for the most likely answer, even though we don't have the exact question. And so it just grows and grows. I hope that's answered what you were asking me, and I hope it wasn't too much of an explanation.
I'm sure Aoife is delighted with that answer. I will also follow up. I have another question from online if we have time there. And it's from Gronia Keegan, and she's asking, do we know what percentage of the records are in Irish? And is it searchable through Irish?
I can't speak to percentages. I actually have to hand over to Peter for that.
Irish language documents, there were only 5, but
there were only 5.
So an infinitesimal percentage.
Yeah. So
that's very good.
But I'm with you in the disappointment on that.
Having
said that, if
the
Irish place name is a big thing, because we integrated the login data. But if the content wasn't there, I suppose we're saying yes, we could have searched in Irish. We're language agnostic in that approach.
Actually, I have another question
we have
from
another
online as
question.
well, and this question has come from John Donovan, and he says, thank you for such a wonderful project, and is there any intent to integrate with NAOI records or other future records?
I think you might be going to National Archives Ireland, so they are core partners of the ONU. Yes.
I mean, as far as I know, they're already in the project.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
the National Archives Ireland are one of our core partners, so we're involved with them. In terms of continuing to expand the archive, yeah, we're going to be continuing to add documents to it well into the future, hopefully, and continuing to develop the software as well.
That's everything
That's
from online
it.
for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Kieran, you have a question.
This might be a kind of a broad question. Sorry, I'm involved in the project, so this is me being a bit mean and asking my colleagues from the project for their opinion on something. But this is it's historians and archivists and computer scientists. Did you find that historians, so the historians on the panel, that you changed how you think about your history? I think about history in a totally different way, having worked with these other guys that aren't part of our normal historian club. And if you want to say, look, I view myself, and I won't give it, but just because the panel, I'm curious to know, what did you think about doing history, having been through this project?
I mean, yeah, I can jump in on this one because I suppose I can speak for us all. We've all been working to a greater or lesser extent with the computer science team and on various different aspects of the project. For me, it was working with the knowledge graph and on that side of the project certainly made me think in terms of broader strokes and larger structures. taking the kind of material that we were looking at in a medieval context and trying to build something that would be much more applicable. And kind of like Gary was saying earlier, you know, we've got 7 centuries of history, and the structures that we needed to build and put in place needed to go beyond one particular historical area. So in that sense, it actually gets you out of your comfortable wheelhouse and something to say, okay, I'm a 15th century historian of an Irish Parliament, and instead you were going much further and thinking much more broadly about the type of history that you do. So it's been extremely rewarding, quite challenging at times, for me anyway. I don't know if you guys would agree.
Yeah, I guess I have 2 things that occur to me with that. The first is, I would say from my own background as a researcher, I had done some work with digital humanities, so to a certain extent the CS side wasn't entirely new or unfamiliar, certainly in terms of the intricacies of it. Like we saw a lot behind the back end rather than just dealing with the front production. So that was something new. But I think the main thing that's come out of this for me is understanding the scale and the potential for how the 2 really can collaborate together. And I feel like there's a big difference, and there's still quite a divide between the idea of using something from the front end, which is incredibly useful as a researcher, like transcribers, but then working with the people that are building that. So working directly with Gary, you get a very different understanding of what these tools can do and how they're built, and the interaction between how we as historians think when we look at something that's technological compared to how it's built at the back end to make it usable for us. And the scale of what's out there, I mean, a digital humanities project has been things like, oh, well, I'm going to image my, if things, and maybe I'll do some, text recognition of them. That was digital humanities for a long time. But this is a whole other world of what digital humanities is now when you're coming from being a historian. So I'd say that's something that's kind of changed my thinking around the scalability of what it means to be involved with DH. From the other side, as a historian, I mean, as I was saying, the scale and the breadth in date and in content of what we've been looking at. I'm an architectural historian, and most of what I've looked at is not to do with architectural history, I can tell you. So it's very much broadened my idea of what is, at a very basic level, of what documents are actually out there, which sounds kind of naive as a historian. Like, you know what's out there, but we've had to deal with things that are specialist documents for entirely different fields, still in history, but not within our specialty. So I think it's really broadened my idea of what source material is for historians and how they use it in different ways.
No, I'd speak to that and agree with Sarah, really. I mean, I think Dave said this several times. So the era where you cannot have a certain level of tech savviness as a historian is sort of coming to an end. It's not already over. A certain ability to deal with these aspects of digital humanities we're talking about in terms of scale, scope, and functionality. I mean, it's just be a prerequisite for history postgraduates and graduates and going to the future. I think that this project has really hammered home that for me. Sort of the era of sort of doing it analog is over. I think maybe that's a little bit too apocalyptic.
On that bombshell. Sorry, one last question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, ask
It's
question.
going to sound like a really stupid question as well, but I'm just wondering, it's shocking to me that there was only 7 documents that were in Irish, and I'm wondering if history is kind of, when we're looking at history in theatre, say for instance, you kind of go, okay, you can look at programs, you can look at reviews, you can look at all sorts of things, but like the oral history then, is another whole area, and you can sort of look back at the past with a prescribed way of looking, if you know what I mean. And I just wonder, what do you think about all of that? Are we looking back at the past through an English document?
Well, I mean, to say that, I think about that a lot, because there's a danger in this. These are the state papers, or they're official records. There's a danger that you begin to see like a state. You don't necessarily have to, though. You can read documents against the grain. I mean, you're talking about sort of limitations of there not being very many Irish language sources. Okay, but say something like, again, I work on the Chief Secretary's office. It's got a special sort of responsibility for law and order. It's very interested in what Irish speakers are doing and saying in Tipperary of the 1760s. Now, the documents are being sent to it by magistrates who are writing in English who understand Irish, so there's a buffer. you can look at that the way the Chief Secretary's Office would look at it as a law and order issue, or you can read those and sort of put yourself in someone else's position and begin to look for things other than simple law and order issues, but about the prevalence of Irish, for instance, or economic fluctuations in the market economy and what it's doing to sort of tenant farmers. That's an example. So no, you're making a very good point, and that's one of the benefits, I think, of working on this program, to begin to sort of see how documents and historical records are created. They're not simply puffed into existence. They're created by entities, states, administrations, and you have to have that knowledge of you are seeing things from a very specific point of view.
And that's absolutely fundamentally the case with the legal exchequer. That is the English state. That is the English state at work. You won't find any. You'll find names that are in Irish. The documents will be in Latin, but they will be talking about people whose lives would have been lived in Irish. And you see how you read them, how you think about what does this actually tell us. We know it's easy to read them as what the state wants us to know. These are the things that bring you into contact with the English state, the legal English state. But you can also start reading them as what is Irish society like? What are the groups that are living and working and interacting on the island at that time? So it's all about how you read it, how do you work with it, read that overarching awareness of these are the records of the English craft interacting with the peoples that they've been installing.
I think there's also something else though in that everyone on the team, in case you haven't realised, we all come from very different backgrounds. And so the way in which we have looked at the records and examined them has also, I would say, had an impact on the things that we have found. So we've been looking for things with our own background and our own lens and our own research areas, which I think has then meant that there's actually probably a broader and a more nuanced collection of documents in the Treasury already, let alone what will be there, that is maybe slightly, greatly more nuanced than how even Wood would present what had been there. You know, that was one man's perspective in writing of what the records were and what they represented. And I think we've brought that ourselves into what's there. And I think that's also one of the strengths of the way in which the project's been built and the way the computer science stuff in particular has been built, is that the way in which the public can interact with this will not necessarily be through those lenses. They can be if that's what they're researching and that's how they think. But having transcribus and text searchability and being able to search for keywords and ideas and people and places means that people can discover stories within the records in a way that maybe hasn't necessarily been the story of those records when we've just thought about them as being something distant that academics write about somewhere in the basement. So I think a potential outcome of this is that it's actually going to enable those types of stories to really emerge from the records and to give a far more nuanced and a different view of different aspects of Irish history that hadn't necessarily been appreciated in the same way in the past.
Thank you. There's a question.
It's just a remark about the when you mentioned the oral history. It's just as I'm a technologist, right? So, and maybe this is a beyond 2030 project, but you know the focus here has been about the record being the document, right? But if you look at the technology and the capabilities that are evolving here in terms of oral processing and recording and actually analysing video and so on, you can imagine a time when some of these records are in some sense other media besides just documents. And what's interesting about the approach that's been taken here is the technical underpinnings. You cope with that because it's all about how do you mark it up, how do you, in that sense, deal with the form of the thing you have, the raw source in the first place, and then how you mark that up, and then all the other things that we have there in terms of making more accessible, making more queryable, still comes into play. But I think it'll be an interesting project, I think, down the road to see, right, well, maybe if there are oral records out there that we can start to incorporate or video of the time, for example, it might be an interesting piece to start bringing into the virtual treasury.
Thank you. So I think if there's no further questions, we should probably wrap up. So this has been an amazing series of presentations. It's very clear that now that this digital infrastructure has been built, it's really only scratching the surface of what we can do. I mean, there's tremendous potential for archival management and digitisation, for the way that we unlock historical content, the type of content that's in scope, the audiences, and the way that it's mediated. So this is, I hope, just the beginning of a much deeper conversation about how this can all be taken forward. But please join me in thanking this incredible team. And thank you all for joining us today, and thank you so much for all of your questions and input. And there's a cup of tea. There's a cup of tea out there, which you're very welcome to join us and continue to have a chat and discussion. So thank you very much.